She was hired to be a nanny, but what Eleanor didn't know was that the little girl behind the pink door was her own daughter, stolen years ago after a tragic accident. As secrets buried under floorboards begin to surface, a house of wealth becomes a stage for lies, stolen identities, and a mother's quiet rebellion. When power tries to silence the truth, one child's word, music, becomes the thread that unravels everything. Stay with us until the end to witness how love, memory, and courage can resurrect what was once lost, and how a song can bring a family back together. Eleanor Ross stepped out of the car with slow, deliberate precision, her long navy dress brushing the tops of her boots as she leaned on the door for balance. The driver reached for her luggage, but she lifted a gloved hand to stop him, offering only a polite, distant smile. "I've got it," she said. Her tone was calm, but her voice carried the faint rasp of someone who had spent too long speaking to ghosts. The mansion stood ahead like a memory she hadn't yet earned. Tall, symmetrical, the kind of beauty that demanded distance. Eleanor straightened her coat, buttoned to the throat, and adjusted her step. The rhythm of her walk had been trained, a careful choreography meant to conceal the mechanical click beneath her skirt. She'd spent months teaching her body to lie with elegance. When the wrought iron gates opened, she took a breath, as if crossing not into employment but into confrontation. At the door waited Martha Hughes, the Whitmore housekeeper, a woman with sharp eyes and the posture of someone who had long ago stopped pretending to be surprised by life. Martha looked her over, not unkindly, but with a quiet scrutiny that saw more than Eleanor wanted. "You're the new nanny, then," she said, not asking but confirming. Eleanor nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. Eleanor Ross." Martha's gaze lingered a beat too long on her polished boots. "You'll want to keep up with Miss Clara's routine. The child's particular." Eleanor smiled thinly. "So am I." Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and lemon oil, a house too tidy to be kind. Eleanor followed Martha down a long hallway, each step echoing in the hush of wealth that had forgotten how to be warm. On the walls hung portraits of people who had once mattered, men in dark suits, women in lace collars, all painted with the same fixed serenity of the rich and restless. "Mr. Whitmore will see you in the morning," Martha said as they stopped near the staircase. "For now, I'll show you to the nursery." Eleanor nodded, scanning the stairwell, her attention caught by a soft color in contrast to all the beige and mahogany. At the top of the stairs, a pink door was cracked open, a sliver of childlike rebellion against an adult house. The air around it felt different, lighter somehow, the kind of space that resisted grief even when surrounded by it. Martha followed Eleanor's gaze. "She's quiet with strangers," she said, "and after what she's lost, well, you'll see." Eleanor met her eyes, steady but soft. "I understand quiet," she said simply. And she did. Quiet had been her only companion for months. When Eleanor stepped into the nursery, she slowed. The room was tidy but not sterile. On the windowsill sat a small collection of glass animals, a ballerina figurine balanced precariously on one toe. Near the rug, blocks were arranged into what might have been a castle before someone got tired of pretending it was safe. In the center sat Clara, or, as Eleanor's pulse insisted, Lily. The child was smaller than she had imagined, her brown hair falling into her eyes, one sock blue, the other white. She was drawing, or pretending to, her little shoulders tight in concentration. Eleanor felt the air thicken around her. It was absurd, the pull she felt, irrational, dangerous even, but she could no more control it than she could command her heartbeat to stop. Clara looked up, wide-eyed, guarded. "You're not Mrs. Hughes," she said flatly. Eleanor shook her head, lowering her voice. "No, I'm Eleanor. I came to help." "I came." The girl blinked, uncertain. "I don't need help," she murmured. Eleanor crouched, careful and slow, suppressing the tremor that wanted to betray the stiffness in her left leg. "Everyone says that," she replied. "Then they find out they did." Clara's hand stilled over the paper. Her pencil rolled away, stopping near Eleanor's shoe. For a moment they stared at it, neither bending to retrieve it, as though that simple act might define the distance between them. "Why are you looking at me like that?" the child asked suddenly. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Like what?" "Like you're trying to remember something," Clara said, her small brow furrowing. Eleanor smiled, almost breaking. "Maybe I am." She forced a gentle exhale, fighting the swell in her chest. "You draw beautifully." Clara shrugged. "It's just lines." "They don't look like what I want." Eleanor reached into her bag, taking out a small sketchbook. "That's all drawings are, trying to remember something right." The girl tilted her head, then pointed at the book. "Can I see?" Eleanor hesitated. Her sketches were of faces she'd never finished, lullabies turned into graphite. Still, she opened it, letting Clara glance through pages of eyes, smiles, fragments of a memory she refused to name. The girl's gaze stopped at one, a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. "She's pretty," Clara said softly. Eleanor nodded. She was. It was Clara who changed the air between them. She picked up a worn teddy bear from the bed and stepped closer, small feet cautious but sure. She pressed the bear's nose against Eleanor's shoulder, an offering made without words. "He doesn't like strangers either," Clara whispered. Eleanor felt something give way inside her, a wall she had built from survival, cracking under something as simple as kindness. She swallowed. "Then I suppose we'll both have to prove we're not so bad." Clara studied her face, searching for something. Recognition maybe, or safety. Then unexpectedly, "Do you sing?" The question was so sudden that Eleanor almost laughed. It had been so long since anyone had asked her that. "Only songs that calm thunder," she said. And when she saw confusion flicker across the child's expression, she added, "It's what my mother used to say. Songs for when the sky's too loud." Clara nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. She stepped back to her little bed and pulled the blanket to her chin. "Can you sing one now?" Eleanor hesitated, then began, soft, low, almost a whisper, an old melody of comfort she hadn't dared to use since the night of the crash. By the second verse, Clara's eyes were closed. When the last note faded, the room felt heavier and lighter all at once. Clara's breathing had steadied, her small hand resting over the teddy bear's paw. Eleanor stayed there, kneeling, afraid to move and disturb the fragile peace that had filled the space. Martha appeared silently in the doorway, holding a folded sheet. "She hasn't slept like that in weeks," she said quietly, as though not to break the spell. Eleanor only nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Martha lingered, studying her with a kind of cautious curiosity. "You've got a calm about you," she said finally. "Most people come here nervous." Eleanor looked down at her hands, still trembling from the song. "I've had a lot of practice pretending calm," she said. Martha's gaze softened just enough. "Pretending's a good start," she murmured, before disappearing down the hall. Alone again, Eleanor exhaled the breath she'd been holding since she arrived. The mansion still felt like a test she might fail, but in that small room, beside the girl who had once been her baby, there was a flicker of something that hadn't lived in her for a long time. It wasn't hope exactly, it was recognition. A beginning she hadn't expected, but one she couldn't walk away from. The mansion had settled into its nightly hush by the time Eleanor slipped from her room and into the hallway. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was staged, curated, like everything else in this house. Shadows stretched across the corridor, but Eleanor's focus wasn't on the dark. It was on the third floorboard past the grandfather clock, the one she'd noticed earlier, not because it looked different, but because it felt different when she walked over it. That sensation had stayed with her, like a small stone in a shoe. Now, with the house asleep and no eyes on her movements, she returned to that spot, Her cane tapped gently beside her foot as she knelt down, careful not to let her weight fall too hard onto her left side. She pressed her palm flat to the wood. It was a strange thing, to feel a memory humming beneath your skin without knowing what it wanted to say. Eleanor's fingers curled under the edge of the board, testing its resistance. To her surprise, it gave way with a low wooden sigh, revealing a shallow space below. Inside, wrapped in yellowed linen, was a small metal box. No lock, just presence. She opened it. Inside, the past waited in silence. A hospital bracelet, infant-sized, the kind they snap onto newborns before a mother ever sees her child. The name field was smeared, but not erased. The date matched the night of the accident. Her breath caught. Beneath it was a strand of hair tied neatly with faded ribbon, light brown in color, too light to be Richard's daughter by blood. A folded paper rested beneath it, creased and water-stained. Eleanor unfolded it carefully, hands trembling. Just a sentence. "Forgive me. I couldn't keep her safe." No name, no signature. At the bottom of the box lay a simple USB flash drive, worn, labeled only with a strip of hospital tape marked Whitmore C. Eleanor sat back against the wall, the box open on her lap like a confession, like a wound that had never closed. Her throat tightened, but she made no sound. She didn't need to. Grief didn't always scream. Sometimes it whispered, and that was worse. Her mind was a storm, but her body was still. It had found something it had been begging for. Not peace, not yet, but direction. She didn't hesitate long. She closed the box and tucked it beneath her coat, pressing it close to her chest as she moved back down the hallway. The floor creaked again under her feet. That same sound, one that now felt less like a complaint and more like a warning. In the kitchen, a dim light was still on. Martha was there, sipping tea as though she hadn't just watched the house sleep around her. Eleanor entered without a word. Martha looked up and her eyes sharpened immediately. She didn't ask why Eleanor was out of bed or what she carried under her coat. She simply set her cup down. Eleanor placed the box on the table between them and opened it. The objects made no sound, but they didn't need to. Martha looked at them for only a second before she closed her eyes and let out a long, slow exhale. "So it wasn't just me," she murmured. Eleanor met her gaze. "You knew something." "Not what?" Martha answered. "But I knew this house had rot in the walls, things no bleach can scrub out." They didn't speak for several moments. The silence between them was no longer unfamiliar. It had become something sacred. Eleanor pushed the USB drive toward Martha, her expression resolute. "We need to hear it." Martha didn't hesitate. She rose, walked to the pantry, and behind a shelf of canned goods, she reached for a dusty laptop. "I don't trust the ones upstairs," she said simply, plugging the drive into the side. The computer took a moment to wake. The screen flickered. A folder opened. One audio file. They looked at each other, and then Martha clicked play. A woman's voice filled the room, not young, not old, but tired, broken in places. "If you're hearing this, it means it didn't work, and I'm sorry. I tried to fix it. I thought if I gave her to him, she'd be safe." Eleanor didn't recognize the voice, but her gut twisted. It got too big. Too many people, lawyers, doctors. I didn't know where it stopped. Martha's knuckles whitened as she gripped Eleanor's hand. The woman on the recording broke off into shallow breaths. "Tell her I tried. Tell her I didn't want her to be part of this." By the time the audio ended, Eleanor was no longer just holding objects. She was holding evidence, and she was holding the weight of something larger than grief. Betrayal. Clara had been taken, not by accident, not by fate, but by design. Her accident wasn't random. It was curated, managed. And now, proof of that orchestration sat on a kitchen table in the form of a voice that would never speak again, and objects that screamed in silence. Martha leaned back, eyes glassy. but not weak. "Carla Whitmore," she said. That was her voice, Richard's wife. Eleanor's hands curled into fists in her lap. So she knew. "Maybe she tried to stop it," Martha replied. "Maybe she started it." Eleanor rose from the chair slowly, every inch of her spine straight with resolve. She looked down at the box, then to the floor beneath her feet. It was right there. "Under all of us. This whole time," Martha didn't need to answer. The truth had already made itself heard, in the voice, in the evidence, and in the floorboard that hadn't squeaked, but whispered. Eleanor stood in the center of the kitchen, her hand still resting on the edge of the table, her mind pulling threads tighter and faster. Every lie, every silence, every moment since she stepped into the Whitmore mansion had been part of a performance. And now, the script had changed. Martha watched her closely. "What will you do with it?" she asked. Eleanor turned her face toward the dark window, seeing only her reflection staring back. "I'm going to finish what she started," she said. "And I'm not going to whisper." Martha nodded once, the weight of years pressing into her shoulders. "Then you'll need help, and I'm not as old as I look." They said nothing more. The laptop remained open. The drive still glowed faintly, but the box was closed, its contents remembered, its secrets no longer safe. Upstairs, Clara slept, unaware that beneath the floorboards, her truth had finally started to rise. Eleanor didn't move again for several minutes. She simply stood still, breathing like someone who had just surfaced from deep water. The house hadn't shifted, but she had. The floor hadn't lied. It never had. It had been a minor thing at first. A painting slightly crooked in the library, something anyone else would dismiss as the result of careless dusting or an uneven nail. But Eleanor had seen it for what it was, a misalignment not caused by chance, but intention. People who have lost enough become fluent in the quiet language of things left out of place. That frame, heavy and ornate, was the only one in the room that tilted, and only from up close. From the doorway, it appeared perfect. She remembered it suddenly, while Martha was talking about hospital seals and timelines. Eleanor interrupted her mid-sentence. "The painting, in the library, it's not fixed to the wall." Martha looked at her with surprise, but didn't question. Together, they returned to the room. Eleanor reached for the frame, feeling along its edges. When she pressed a finger behind the top left corner, something clicked. The painting swung open like a door, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. No dramatic hinges or gusts of air, just the truth, exposed. Eleanor took a breath. "We're going down there." Martha hesitated only a second before nodding. "After you, then." The stairs creaked beneath their weight, but neither woman spoke. Their silence wasn't fear, it was anticipation, a shared understanding that whatever lay below would alter everything. At the bottom, a cramped archive room revealed itself. File cabinets lined the walls, metal drawers dented with age. On a long table, folders labeled with clinical codes, stamps from facilities Eleanor had never heard of, and patient numbers instead of names. She opened the first one with trembling hands, records from a pediatric rehabilitation clinic, a list of surgeries billed under falsified insurance claims. Another folder showed a list of infant transfers between hospitals, their origins erased and replaced with vague relocation codes. Then came receipts, money wired in increments, some under donor labels, others under dummy shell companies. Martha stared at the papers in disbelief. This wasn't just one child. This was an operation. Eleanor's hands tightened around a folder stamped with Clara's birth date. "And we've only scratched the surface." Her voice was steady, but something inside her splintered. Every line item in those files wasn't just data. It was a stolen child, a silenced parent, a doctored truth. Eleanor closed the folder. "We have to take these." But they weren't alone. A voice slithered from the far corner of the room, smooth as glass but carrying the chill of warning. I'd suggest you leave those exactly where you found them. Eleanor turned sharply, her eyes narrowing as Darryl Knox stepped from the shadows. He wasn't startled, nor was he armed, not visibly, but the way he stood, the way his lips barely curled into a smile, made it clear he didn't need weapons. Men like him operated with confidence bred from impunity. "You've been busy," he said, his tone almost conversational. "But you've been digging in the wrong graveyard." Eleanor didn't flinch. "No," she replied, "I've been digging in the only place where the truth hadn't been completely buried." Martha shifted beside her, inching closer to the table, hands near a folder. Darryl noticed. Now, he said, wagging a finger, "let's not turn this into something unpleasant. What would Clara think? Her sweet little Nanny turning into a thief." The mention of Clara made Eleanor's spine lock into place. He was doing it deliberately, weaving the child into his threats, making her the anchor of their fear. But Eleanor didn't yield. "You talk too much," she said flatly, stepping forward, "and you covered too much that should have been confessed. Children aren't paperwork. They aren't favors. They aren't yours." Darryl's face didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A small withdrawal, a recalibration. "You're brave," he said, "or stupid. It's a thin line." Martha, never one to shrink, added quietly, "And yet here you are, trying to scare women in basements." That cut deeper than Darryl expected, and his smirk twitched. But he didn't move to stop them. He was buying time, for whom they couldn't know. Eleanor made her decision then. She reached for the folder containing Clara's records and tucked it into her coat. If she had to run, she would. If she had to crawl, she would, but she wouldn't leave without it. Darryl stepped toward her. "You take that, and I won't stop what comes next." Eleanor looked him in the eye. "Good. Neither will I." That was when they heard it. A small sound behind them, light footsteps from the stairs. A shadow moved. Clara stood at the top step, pajama-clad and clutching a piece of paper. How long she had been there, they couldn't say. Her eyes darted to Eleanor, then to Darryl. She looked frightened, but not frozen. With deliberate steps, she descended. Darryl turned slightly, uncertain. Clara walked straight to Eleanor and handed her the paper. A note scrawled in childish handwriting, one word underlined in red crayon: music. Eleanor stared at it, then looked at the girl. "What's this?" Clara shrugged, eyes wide. "I heard you talking. You said names, but I remembered music. It was nonsense, or it should have been." But something in Eleanor's chest aligned. The word wasn't random. It was Clara's anchor, her clue, her memory. Darryl tried to speak, but Eleanor raised her hand. "No, we're done talking." She folded the paper gently and tucked it into her coat just above the folder. That single word was worth more than everything in the room combined, because it hadn't been coerced or stolen. It had been remembered, chosen, a truth from the only voice that mattered. And that was all Eleanor needed. As Clara leaned into her side, Eleanor wrapped an arm around her and turned her back to Darryl. She didn't need his threats or his approval. What mattered had already been decided by a 5-year-old girl who'd chosen one word to speak for everything she couldn't explain. As they ascended the stairs together, Martha following close behind with 3 more folders tucked beneath her coat, Eleanor's heart beat not with fear but clarity. She had found the thread, Clara had remembered it, and now it would unravel the entire tapestry. At the top, Eleanor looked down once more. Darryl hadn't moved, but his silence was no longer power. It was defeat. When they returned to the main floor, Eleanor didn't let go of Clara's hand. She didn't need to. The child had given her everything, a word, a memory, a direction. And now, nothing else mattered but that single note. Music, everything. The secrets, the lies, the pain could burn. That word would remain. Everything was worth it for that. The message had arrived just before midnight, slipped under the door in silence. Eleanor had been in the kitchen with Martha, reviewing the documents they had smuggled out from the secret archive. There was no name on the envelope, just a single line typed in bold black ink. If you open your mouth, the girl disappears. Eleanor read it twice, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't cry out. She didn't collapse. She folded the message in half with deliberate calm, set it on the table and stood. "She's not in her room," she said. Martha looked up sharply. "What?" Eleanor didn't answer. She was already moving. Her body didn't feel the pain anymore. Not the stiff metal biting into her thigh, not the limp that usually shadowed her steps. Only the knowledge that someone had taken Clara. She flew up the stairs, skipped 2 steps at a time, and pushed open the pink door. The room was cold. The window was wide open. The small bear Clara slept with lay on the floor, its tiny arm pointing to nothing and everything. Eleanor didn't scream. She moved to the window, scanned the grounds, and saw it. A white van pulling away near the southern gate. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted back down the stairs, her mind narrowing to a single objective: get her back. The pain she usually managed with pills and pacing was gone, overtaken by rage and adrenaline. She shoved open the front door and ran into the yard barefoot, dress flying behind her, scanning for a vehicle. Then she saw it again, just a blur of white near the edge of the estate road. "Lily!" she screamed, the name tearing out of her chest with the force of memory and blood. Inside the van, a small face turned toward the sound. Lily, sat in the back seat, frozen, her hands tucked into her lap. She heard her name and blinked as if the syllables had cracked a layer of ice she didn't know surrounded her. The hesitation was barely a second, but it was enough. Eleanor didn't stop running. She grabbed her shoulder bag, heavier now with evidence and desperation, and with all the strength she had left, hurled it at the van's rear tire. The bag hit with a sharp thud, and the van jerked sideways, skidding slightly against the curb. The passenger door flew open, and a man tumbled out, cursing as he tried to regain his balance. Eleanor didn't wait. She dashed forward, closing the last 10 feet with a force that surprised even her. Clara's door opened from the inside, a miracle of instinct or perhaps something deeper. The girl launched herself into Eleanor's arms with a cry that broke through every wall the woman had spent years building. "Mommy," Clara sobbed, the word shaking out of her like a gust of wind after a long drought. Eleanor caught her, wrapped both arms around the girl, and sank to the ground with her. The van door slammed again and tires screeched, but it didn't matter. Clara was here, safe. Eleanor cradled her, whispering her name over and over, not Clara, but Lily, as if by saying it aloud she could stitch their shattered timelines back together. "You remembered," Eleanor whispered. "You remembered me." The girl nodded, her face buried in Eleanor's coat. "I remembered your voice," she said between sobs, "and the song about the thunder." Eleanor rocked her gently, holding on as if the world might break open again at any moment. Sirens wailed in the distance, not a threat this time, but a promise. Blue and red lights spilled onto the road as 2 police cruisers swerved to a stop. Officers emerged, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Martha came out of the house fast for someone her age, a folder clutched in both hands. "Over here," she called, waving one of the files. "She has proof, about the child, about all of it." One officer veered toward her while another helped Eleanor to her feet, his eyes flicking between her and the girl in her arms. "What's her name, ma'am?" he asked. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Lily Ross," she said, her voice iron. "She's my daughter." Another officer approached Darryl Knox, who had emerged from the driver's side of the van. He raised his hands casually, already wearing the mask of innocence. "I'm the property manager," he said coolly. "There must be some mistake." "Maybe," but Martha stepped forward, slapping down a folder against the hood of a cruiser. "The mistake," she said, "was thinking no one would look." Eleanor stood silently as it unfolded. Officers flipped through pages, speaking into radios. Knox's smirk began to crack. Clara, no, Lily, still clung to Eleanor's coat, her small fists gripping the fabric like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. A female officer knelt beside them. "She'll need to be checked," she said gently. "We'll take her to a hospital just to be sure." Eleanor nodded, but her arms didn't loosen. "I'll go with her," she said. "No one else." The officer looked at her, and after a moment nodded. Knox was in cuffs now. His calm demeanor had evaporated. "You think this ends with me?" he spat. "I wasn't the one giving orders." Eleanor didn't answer. She simply turned, carrying her daughter toward the ambulance. Martha walked beside her. "It's over," the older woman whispered. "Not yet," Eleanor said. "But it will be." She stepped into the back of the ambulance and pulled Lily into her lap. The girl pressed her ear to Eleanor's chest and whispered, "I remembered you." Eleanor kissed her temple. "I never forgot you." She wasn't just a nanny anymore. Not the quiet woman with a broken gait and a hidden past. Not the shadow that drifted through the halls of the Whitmore mansion, pretending not to see. Now, she was seen. She was known. Eleanor Ross, mother, witness, survivor, stood in her truth with her daughter in her arms, and her enemies unraveling behind her. The world, once silent, now had to listen. A woman they dismissed had named her child, claimed her space, and fought back with everything she had. And the child, Lily, had remembered. Not the file, not the clinic stamp, not the legal lie. She had remembered a voice, a song, a rhythm only the two of them shared. That was the proof no one could fabricate. That was the truth Darryl Knox couldn't scrub from the records. It wasn't just over. It was rewritten, and as they rode toward the hospital, wrapped in one another, the world behind them burned a little cleaner. Eleanor held her tighter and whispered, "You came back to me." Lily smiled through sleep. "I never left." And in that moment, Eleanor knew they were whole again. Eleanor sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her arms wrapped tightly around Clara's small frame, the girl's head resting against her chest as if it had never belonged anywhere else. The hospital room was sterile, but Eleanor's grip was full of warmth. Clara hadn't spoken much since they arrived, only nodding when nurses asked questions and clinging to Eleanor's coat like a lifeline. But now, cradled safely in the arms that had once sung lullabies into a crib long abandoned, Clara stirred. "Sing," she whispered. Eleanor's throat tightened. She hadn't sung in months. Not since the crash, not since the screaming silence of losing her child. But now her voice emerged, low and trembling, as she began the first lines of the lullaby that had once calmed thunder and soothed restless dreams. "Hush now, little light. Close your weary eyes." Clara, barely audible, joined in. "Let the stars come near, let the dark apologize." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she finished it. Eleanor froze, holding back a sob. That line, that version, had never been part of the song taught in daycare or played in music boxes. That was hers. That was Lily. It wasn't just memory, it was identity. Moments later, a nurse entered holding a beige envelope, sealed and stamped with urgency. "The DNA test," she said quietly, handing it to Eleanor, who held Clara tighter as she reached for it. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside were 2 documents, both clinical, both final. She read them once in silence, lips pressed into a tight line, then again aloud this time for the room to hear. DNA match, 99.9999% probability. Child identified as Lily Ross. Her voice didn't crack. But Richard Whitmore, who had stood near the doorway with his hands buried in his coat pockets, let out a sound like something crumbling. He sat down slowly, stunned, the mask of control peeled from his face. "My wife lied to me," he murmured, eyes unfocused. "All this time." "Martha," Standing behind Eleanor with a trembling cup of tea, let it fall. Ceramic shattered against the floor, and she didn't even flinch. Instead, she pressed her apron to her mouth and sobbed, raw, broken sobs that came from a place far beyond the surface. Eleanor didn't move at first. She was still staring at the page. Then she turned to Clara, kissed her forehead softly and whispered, "Never again apart. Never again silent." The promise hung in the air like scripture. Lily, Clara no more, looked up, her eyes wide. "You found me," she said. Eleanor smiled, eyes wet. "I never stopped." But peace, as Eleanor had come to understand, was fragile. More fragile than truth, more fragile than proof. It didn't last an hour. Two men in grey suits entered the hospital wing with impeccable timing and predatory calm. They carried briefcases and wore expressions polished for courtrooms. "Ms. Ross," one began, not bothering to ask permission to speak. "We're here to escort the child for further questioning and legal reassessment. You're not listed as a custodial guardian." Eleanor's grip on Lily instinctively tightened. "You're joking," she said flatly. "You have the DNA report." The taller of the two men offered a tight smile. "DNA is evidence, not authorization, until the courts rule." "The courts?" Richard cut in, voice rising. "You're threatening her with bureaucracy?" The man barely looked at him. "We're executing a custody protection order based on prior guardianship filings." Martha, now standing behind Eleanor, hissed, "Filings signed by a dead woman." The air thickened with tension. Lily whimpered. Eleanor stood slowly, placing her body between the girl and the men. "If you take another step, I swear to God—" "You'll what?" the second man said. That was all she needed to hear. Eleanor grabbed the lamp off the bedside table and smashed it against the floor, the bulb exploding in a burst of sparks and hot filaments. The room filled with sharp smoke and electrical dust. In the same instant, Martha darted to the window and yanked the thick curtains from their rods, throwing them across the floor, fueling the smoke cloud. "Go!" she shouted. Richard, momentarily stunned, lunged toward the emergency alarm and yanked it. Red lights strobed. Eleanor scooped Lily into her arms again, ignoring the shooting pain in her leg. "Hold on to me, baby," she whispered. The girl buried her face in her shoulder. They dashed out of the room as nurses flooded the corridor in panic. The men in suits tried to follow, coughing and disoriented, but by the time they cleared the doorway, Eleanor was already down the hall. Martha was a blur of movement behind them, barking orders to staff, lying when necessary, fierce as fire. Richard stayed behind, blocking the exit, yelling into his phone to summon their attorney. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't planned, but it was enough. They didn't disappear. They escaped, with smoke and fury, and one broken lamp. They didn't speak until they were outside, hidden in the back of a laundry truck that a sympathetic orderly had offered in silent allegiance. Lily lay curled against Eleanor's chest, calm again, as if the storm had passed once more and her harbor had held. Martha sat beside them, clutching the folder with every scrap of proof they had. Eleanor met her eyes. "They're not going to stop." Martha nodded. "Neither are we." Richard, now beside them, handed Eleanor his car keys. "You drive. I'll misdirect them." Eleanor didn't ask how. She simply started the engine and pulled onto a back road that cut through the edge of town. The city blurred behind them. Ahead was uncertainty, but not silence. Not anymore. What had once been whispers buried under floorboards and shadows now had faces, voices, and fire. And this time they wouldn't go quietly. This time they would sing their names. The world would not be silent again. In the dim light of the shelter's office, Eleanor inserted the flash drive once more, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from the weight of knowing this was the final piece. The makeshift walls around her were thin, buzzing with voices from the next room. Volunteers sorting donations, children playing. None of it reached her. She stared at the loading bar as if it were a verdict. When the video opened, the frozen frame showed Carla Whitmore sitting in a room Eleanor didn't recognize. Sterile, anonymous. Carla's skin was pale, not from makeup, but from whatever had been haunting her. Her hair was tied back hastily, her hands clenched in her lap. Then she spoke, voice strained but steady. "If you're watching this, I'm probably dead," she began, and Eleanor inhaled sharply. "I accepted the exchange. I signed the forms. I was a coward. I told myself I'd fix it, that I'd make it right, but I didn't." She looked off camera briefly, then back. "Lily was never mine. I knew that. I wanted something untouched. I thought money would protect us, but I was wrong. And if you're watching this, I hope you burn it all down." The video ended with a loud metallic sound, a door, or perhaps a gunshot. Eleanor closed the laptop like sealing a coffin. There were no tears. Not now. Not anymore. Eleanor sat still for a moment, breathing slowly, feeling the ghost of her former self dissolve one confession at a time. This wasn't just grief over a stolen child. This was the full mourning of what wealth, power, and fear could do when mixed unchecked. Carla's words hadn't shocked her. They had confirmed what her gut already knew, that there had been a moment, maybe several, when someone could have saved Lily without Eleanor ever needing to step foot in that house. But no one had. Silence had been the choice. Inaction, the shield. And now Carla was gone. Eleanor found herself grieving a woman she had never met, and yet who had lived inside the shadows of her life for 6 long years. She whispered, "You didn't deserve forgiveness, but you gave me truth. That's something." She stood up slowly, her leg aching under the pressure, and glanced at the tiny scrap of paper Lily had drawn on earlier. A crude sketch of a house with music notes rising from the roof. She tucked it into her coat pocket. This wasn't over. There were still papers, files, proof, secrets waiting to be dragged out from under luxury and polished lies. It was Richard who insisted they return to the mansion that same night. "He'll destroy the rest," he said, pacing, anger radiating from his skin. "Now that he knows we have the video, Darryl won't wait. He'll burn everything." Eleanor agreed. So did Martha, though her hands were shaking when she reached for her coat. "We go together," Eleanor said. "No one alone." The drive was silent, each of them lost in thought, about what had been taken, about what had been ignored. When they pulled into the long gravel driveway, the mansion looked unchanged. Its windows still glowed with artificial warmth, but Eleanor knew better. The house had already begun to rot from the inside out. They entered through the back door, same as always. Martha led them to the library, where Eleanor immediately went to the bookshelf, the same one where the first file had been found. "Behind here," she whispered. "It'll be there." Richard was near the window, watching for movement. Martha lit the small lantern they'd brought. The silence was too clean, too careful. Eleanor knew that kind of quiet. It wasn't peace, it was a trap. She was the first to see the gun. It glinted near the grandfather clock, held steady by Darryl Knox. He stepped out from behind the curtain like a man used to getting ahead of the truth. His smile was tight, humorless, full of splinters. "I warned you," he said, voice calm as a bedtime story. "You don't walk into a lion's den with bedtime songs and think you'll get out singing." Richard stepped forward, but Darryl aimed. "Don't be a hero, Whitmore. Your father wasn't." Eleanor didn't flinch. She stood straighter, her voice razor-sharp. "And you covered too much that should have been confessed. That makes you a coward, not a lion." His finger twitched on the trigger. "You have no idea what kind of men I work for," he hissed. "This whole system is already collapsing," Eleanor cut in. "We have the video, Carla's confession, the adoption records. You're done." Darryl's expression cracked for a split second. "Just enough." Richard moved. The shot rang out like a verdict. Richard had tackled him, but not before firing. The bullet caught Darryl in the shoulder, sending him reeling backward. He screamed, the gun clattering to the floor. Eleanor grabbed it immediately and kicked it across the room. "You're lucky it was your shoulder," Richard growled, standing up with blood on his sleeve. Martha had already called the police, her voice low and steady as she gave the address. Eleanor knelt near Darryl, meeting his furious, frightened eyes. "You'll answer for every document, every child, every lie," he spat. "They'll bury me with a handshake." "Not this time," she said, standing as sirens approached in the distance. Blue and red lights began to bathe the walls of the mansion, no longer regal but exposed. Truth had arrived with steel bracelets. By the time the officers entered, guns drawn, Darryl was moaning on the floor, clutching his shoulder, while Eleanor handed over the files. "Every name is in here," she told them. "Every illegal adoption, every bribe, it's all here." They took the evidence with grave expressions, already calling it in. The paramedics took Darryl, restrained and groaning. Martha gave her statement without needing a prompt. Richard offered names, dates. Eleanor didn't speak again. She walked through the halls one last time, feeling the air shift. The lies were no longer festering, they were bleeding out in the open. She paused in the entryway, looking up at the grand chandelier. "Let it rot," she muttered, then turned her back. The house no longer held her daughter. It no longer held power, only consequences. At long last, the mansion reeked not of perfume and polish, but of truth, and that was exactly how it should be. Months had passed, but the memory of that night, the sirens, the shot, the scream, never fully faded. Still, something entirely new had bloomed where shadows once ruled. The Whitmore mansion, once a mausoleum of silence and secrets, had been reborn as the Lily House Institute. The name was hand-painted over the arched entryway in soft cursive, chosen by Eleanor not just for her daughter, but for every child who had ever been stolen, forgotten, or silenced. The ornate rooms were now filled with books, chalkboards, musical instruments, and children's voices that spilled into the hallways like wind through leaves. Where cold protocol once kept hearts frozen, warmth now ruled the rhythms of each day. Eleanor no longer wore coats to hide. She walked freely, her prosthetic visible, her head high. She was no longer the nanny. She was director, mentor, and symbol, though she resisted titles with a stubborn humility. Martha moved through the kitchen with purpose, stirring stews and stories in equal measure. "A full stomach softens even the sharpest grief," she often said. Richard, ever quiet, had taken over the Institute's administrative heart, balancing budgets and navigating donations with silent dedication. Together, they kept the place breathing. Together, they healed. The children who arrived at Lily House came with bruises you couldn't see. Some didn't speak for days. Others flinched at raised voices or refused to sleep without lights on. Eleanor met each child where they were, without questions, only presence. She listened. Sometimes that was all they needed. Other times, she taught them songs, small melodies that anchored them back to a world where trust was possible. Lily, now called Clara, only in formal paperwork, was the unofficial lighthouse of the house. She helped the younger ones learn the routine, often guiding them with gestures and soft whispers. She had grown, taller, braver, and yet still carried a quietness that Eleanor never tried to fill. Instead, she honored it. The girl practiced piano in the mornings before breakfast. Her fingers danced, unsure at first, but more certain with each passing week. She didn't play with flourish or ambition. She played like someone exhaling after holding her breath for too long. The sound, especially that first note, always made Eleanor pause. There was something sacred about it, like someone knocking gently at the door of a wound, and the wound, for once, answering back. One grey Tuesday, a nurse arrived unannounced. She wore her uniform like armor, shoulders tight, expression wary, as if bracing for punishment. Eleanor recognized her immediately, though they had never spoken. Her name tag read R. Delaney. In her hands, she clutched a worn brown folder, edges curled, seal already broken. "These belong to you," she said, voice brittle. Inside were nursery records, dates, birth charts, and a series of forged adoption signatures that made Eleanor's chest tighten. There was her name, her daughter's. Another woman's initials, signed with hesitation. "I was there that night," the nurse admitted. "I didn't know at first, but later I stayed quiet. For my job, for my child's medical bills." Her voice cracked. "It doesn't matter now, but it should have then." Eleanor didn't speak. She read every page, then lifted her eyes. No rage, no indictment, only a long, steady look that pierced and released at once. "You carried this long enough," Eleanor said simply. "You can put it down now." The nurse broke, not from scorn, but from unexpected grace. Martha offered her tea. Richard took the folder and filed it with care, not to bury it, but to honor what had almost been erased. The truth had become more than evidence. It was curriculum. In the Lily House workshop room, Eleanor had begun holding weekly sessions for older children and teens. Not therapy, not exactly, but something in between. They wrote letters they never sent. They painted parts of their lives they couldn't name. They tore paper and glued it back together. They whispered things into glass jars and sealed them shut. And some days they just listened to music. Eleanor would say, "Your past isn't your prison, it's your paint." And they believed her because she didn't speak like a teacher. She spoke like someone who had bled and stood back up. The walls of the old library now held framed fragments of these workshops, a drawing of a bridge, a sculpture of a broken lock, a paper chain of words like brave, not your fault, mine now. The mansion didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt reclaimed, like the bones of something terrible had been remade into something that mattered. The children, once ghosts in their own stories, were becoming authors, and Eleanor, for the first time in years, allowed herself to feel pride that didn't sting. Clara's favorite place was the piano room, a space once used for guests who never stayed long. Now it had windows open daily, and the dust was long gone. One afternoon, Eleanor found her there alone, hands resting on the keys. "Mom," Clara whispered, almost afraid to say it even now, "do you think I'll remember the songs when I'm older?" Eleanor walked to her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to remember every note," she said. "Just the feeling it gave you. That's what stays." Clara nodded, then played a single note, the one she always began with, a C, simple, clear, and full of something deeper than sound. "That one," she said. "That one always makes the silence go away." Eleanor felt her throat tighten, but she didn't cry. Instead, she sat beside her daughter and pressed the note again with her. Together, they held it just a little longer. Outside the room, Martha called that dinner was ready. Richard passed by the doorway with folders under his arm. Life moved forward. But in that moment, between key and echo, a truth settled. Healing wasn't a moment. It was music. And the first note had already been sung. Later that night, Eleanor stepped out onto the back porch, watching the last of the children get tucked in by the night staff. The stars had come out, careless and bright. In her hands, she held the folder the nurse had brought. She didn't reread it. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked to the large filing cabinet they'd installed in what used to be the Whitmore's trophy room. She opened a drawer labeled Origins, slid the folder inside, and closed it softly. No locks, no secrets. Just truth, stored, accessible to any child who might one day ask, "Where did I come from?" That night, Lily played her piano before bed. Eleanor listened from the hallway, a quiet witness. When the familiar note rang out, the one Clara loved most, the one that opened silences, Eleanor closed her eyes. The house breathed. The past no longer screamed. It taught. And for the first time in a long time, the future had a melody. 1 year had passed since the Institute's doors opened to the world, not just as a place of learning, but of unlearning pain. The seats of the auditorium, once filled with dust and denial, were now occupied by social workers, city officials, survivors, students, donors, and skeptics alike. But for Eleanor, none of that mattered. She wasn't speaking for approval. She was speaking for the ones who still hadn't found their voices. Dressed simply, without makeup or pretense, she stood behind the podium, her daughter Lily seated beside her at the piano. The girl glanced at her mother once, a soft, steady look, then placed her fingers on the keys. She began to play the song, the one that had first bridged silence and belonging. The first note rose into the air, and the room fell utterly still. Eleanor didn't speak over it. She waited, let the melody finish its journey. When the final note drifted to rest, she took a breath and began. "I didn't come here for applause," Eleanor said, her voice unwavering. "I came for change." She looked around, scanning every face, especially the ones trying not to meet her gaze. "Don't call me a hero. I'm not brave by choice. I'm a mother who ran into fire because someone took my child. I'm a woman who stood back up after the world said, 'Stay down.' That doesn't make me special. It makes me stubborn." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the crowd, quickly replaced by silence again. This institute isn't a miracle. It's a necessity. Children are still being erased. Families are still being bought. We cleaned one house, but the rot is deeper, so I ask for no statues. I ask for funding, for policies, for accountability. For every child whose name is still being whispered instead of shouted. For every girl who still thinks her silence is safer than her truth. She paused. "This is not a celebration, it's a call." A small hand raised in the fourth row. Eleanor saw it immediately. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, with shoulder-length braids and metal crutches propped against her seat. Her voice was small, but clear. "I lost a leg too," she said, almost apologetically, like it might not matter enough. The room held its breath. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She stepped away from the microphone and descended the steps slowly, carefully, not out of weakness, but intention. Each step was a choice. When she reached the girl, she knelt, fully, her prosthetic clicking softly beneath her dress. She looked the child in the eyes, resting her hands gently on her shoulders. "You didn't lose anything," Eleanor said, her voice warm, fierce, true. "You gained rhythm, a rhythm no one else has, and it's yours." The girl blinked rapidly, then fell forward into Eleanor's arms. The hug was not dramatic, it was quiet, real, a beginning. From the stage, Lily watched with a soft smile tugging at her mouth. She didn't clap. She didn't need to. Her music had already spoken for her. Behind her, near the auditorium doors, Martha stood leaning slightly on the wall, wiping her hands on her apron, even though she hadn't cooked today. She clapped once, slowly, and soon others joined, not for a performance but for a promise. Beside her, Richard held up a single document, not a photo op, not a press release, a birth certificate. The name read clearly, Lily Ross. The ink was dry. The truth had been legally recognized finally. But to them it had always been real. Richard's eyes glistened, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence had always been his vow. The music began again. This time, not from Lily alone, but from others joining. A boy with a violin, a girl tapping rhythm on her lap, a chorus of hesitant hums that soon found harmony. The song moved through the space like something alive, not decoration, but declaration. A sound that refused to be silenced again. It wound its way up the stairwell, through the hallways, into the offices and corners where pain once hid. It was not flawless, but it was free, and that made it perfect. Eleanor returned to the stage, this time not to speak, but to sit beside her daughter. Together they listened. The building, once haunted by unspeakable secrets, now held only echoes of healing. And beneath all of it, the notes, the names, the new beginnings, the very floor seemed to hum. The same floor that once covered over betrayal and brokenness now vibrated with joy. Not loudly, just enough. Enough to remind those who had walked across it that nothing truly buried stays quiet forever. That sometimes pain becomes music. That sometimes wood remembers footsteps with grace. The audience stood, not because someone told them to, but because something inside them did. As the final chord was struck, Eleanor placed her hand on Lily's back and whispered something no one else heard. The world had listened, finally, and beneath their feet, the floor that once hid so much now sang. We poured our hearts into creating this story, and we hope it touched yours. If it did, we'd love to hear what it meant to you. Share your thoughts in the comments. By subscribing to our channel, you help us continue bringing meaningful stories like this one to life. It takes us over a week to craft each of these narratives with care and emotion, and your support means the world to us. Thank you for being here with us. We're a community built on connection, and you're a part of it.